All right. Welcome to Shelf Help. Today we're speaking with Tara Foster, who's joining us from Denver. And Tara's recently joined Evergreen, a better for you waffle brand, which we'll talk about here in just a second, where she came on board as the COO. And before joining Evergreen, Tara spent about a decade in the ingredient space before joining the nutpods team in the early days, where she helped build the brand into, I believe, the number 2 in the plant-based creamer category, which is quite a feat. So excited to get into it. So yeah, first up for the listeners, Tara, maybe just for the ones that aren't as familiar with Evergreen, just give us just a quick lay of the land in terms of origin story, why behind the brand, core products you guys currently offer, and maybe just a few places that people can get their hands on them.
Yeah, definitely. So it's a frozen waffle company or frozen breakfast, I guess is what we would say, but all of the more in the better for you category with real ingredients like eggs, avocado oil, no seed oils, but also hidden veggies, which is kind of really the core of the product. And Emily Groden founded the company about 5 years ago, really just wanted to cook something nutritious and healthy for her kids in the kitchen. And it became super popular with her friends and eventually launched the company. So you can find it Sprouts, Whole Foods, and we're getting ready to launch in Kroger. We just launched in Target. So lots of different places.
Awesome. Well, yeah, talking about your nut pod days, hailing from what I believe was at the very early days when you joined into that number 2 spot in that plant-based creamer category, and what I imagine was a 9-figure run rate, if not even more. So I feel like it's probably safe to assume the supply chain definitely evolved quite a bit. So I'm just kind of curious, maybe just to start off, what did the supply chain look like in year 1 versus year 10 when that last year you were there, and what were some of those biggest supply chain unlocks along the way, let's say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I did. I started on the founding team. Literally, the founder, Madeline Hayden, had a formula that she made in the blender in her kitchen. And so it was really, I mean, it was even a year and a half before we had finished product to sell and market because there's a whole bunch of scale up and product testing to do. And it was a really small founding team. There was really like 5 people on the founding team. So everybody had to do a lot of different things at the beginning. But I think some of the things that were important was, at the beginning stage, like everybody wearing a lot of hats, everybody doing things, being very tactical, and then also finding the right co-man, we owned our ingredient. We really owned our supply chain as far as our ingredients and packaging from the start, which gave us a lot of control and ability to scale easy and know, utilize our relationships with those initial suppliers and leverage them later on down the road.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Owning those ingredients from the get-go, it seems like there can be a lot of value there for sure. So thinking back, at what point did things start to break where you had to make some big adjustments? Like, what were those different stages where you're like, okay, this is not working anymore, we got to pivot or fix this?
I mean, early on, I mean, co-mans are the thing that is always the, area where there could be issues.
Yeah.
And so for us, it was finding a new co-man. We literally at a time we were in an industry where there's the co-man the capacity is tight on it was considered low acid aseptic, and we actually had to move out of one co-man because they had gotten too busy and we had to find another one very quickly. We had 3 months to do it and make that happen. I'd say, balancing scaling at a co-man was a big deal. And also we went into a refrigerated format later on. We started out pretty simple and in shelf stable products, everything was simple. Supply chain was simple, shipping was simple. And then going to a refrigerated product, a different co-man, the formula doesn't always translate the same, so you've got to make adjustments, and then just being able to do consolidated refrigerated shipping and make it make sense financially was definitely a big challenge and a big change.
You touched on co-packers a bit. What's the best way to go about sourcing a co-packer and looking at the different options? And it seems like depending on the brands that you speak with, some have more challenges than others, just in terms of
Mhm.
getting a co-packer's attention, getting them to actually commit the time to working with them on those small initial runs, et cetera. So yeah, maybe just to start, like, what's the best way to go about sourcing co-packer options in
Yeah,
general? Because it doesn't seem like, they market themselves super well. It's not the easiest to find like a list of co-packers. So what's the best way to find?
totally. I mean, yeah, it's just you can't just easily Google. It's still, even if you can find them, it's also still an area where you almost have to have an introduction, right? Like you need to be vouched for that you're somebody who's not just going to waste their time.
Yeah,
And it also depends on what type of co-packer you're
sure.
looking for. Is it dry blending, which is a lot easier? There's a lot more available than something like a beverage. So how complex it is matters. But I mean, the biggest thing is asking people in the industry, everybody you know, like asking people that already do that. And you'd be surprised how many brands, even though you might be in some ways potentially a competitor, people still share knowledge and share information because there's room for everybody. So just ask people you know. I do think, keychains getting a little bit better with, some of the commands going on there, but it's not comprehensive, but it is, something that's there. You can also hire an agency like JPG Resources or hire a consultant, and they'll do kind of an initial I mean, it's kind of expensive, in the 10 to 20, I guess 10 to 30 range, 30K range, depending on what you're doing. But those are some ways, but I think really just asking everybody you know and making those phone calls is the best way to do it. And getting somebody to intro you is how you're going to be able to. Because I think the second part of your question was, how do you get them to pay attention if you're little? Because that's the next step, right? You might be able to find about how do you get them.
Yeah.
Getting them to, you treat them as kind of how you do pitches to investors, really, in my opinion,
Yeah.
is you show them your plan, you get them excited about the brand, the why behind the brand, and what your plans are, and just really get them hyped up about the brand. And then, I mean, the other thing too is a lot of times the packaging or equipment suppliers you can get engaged with, and they also want to try to funnel or support, like Tetra Pak or SIG, like in the beverage world, those two companies will help support and funnel you to the right co-mans or help you kind of get in there and do those startup runs. So really just making them interested in your product and pitching to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, so you've got, let's just say, use Keychain or get referrals or whatnot. You've got a list of a few co-packers that you feel like could be a potential fit. What should that evaluation like checklist look like, and what factors do you feel like are really the most important to consider?
I mean, I think understand at the beginning, you're just, I want a co-packer, but you really need to find out what is their scalability, right? Because you could go in deep and realize, they don't really have a lot of room for growth, or they don't have, the ability to expand. They're not working on putting in the next line in their facility. So asking those kinds of questions about what their growth plans are. Um, and really just, do they have a quality mindset? So you have to be at the plant, you have to visit the plant, see how, when you're doing the tour with the business team or the plant manager, are they interacting with the team there? Like, does it seem like it's a quality mindset? Are they, I mean, it sounds silly, but one of the best indicators is the person you're doing the tour with. Are they on the lookout for stuff? Do they pick up a piece of trash or step over it when they go through the plant? Just little things like that. But I think capacity and quality are kind of two of the biggest factors for sure.
Yeah, capacity and quality certainly makes sense.
Hmm.
So you found the co-packer you like. You're getting to the point where you're going to start putting things on paper and getting towards an agreement. What are feels like the most important things to include in that co-packer agreement to just, I guess, ensure success,
Hmm.
minimize risks in the get-go, and just kind of, making sure expectations are aligned from the get-go, let's say.
Yeah. In early stages, it's like you feel like, oh, I don't have a lot of leverage, which you may not, but just I it's really more about understanding your risk and what you're signing up for. So, capacity commitment. Sometimes you don't even know how much you need, right? But you want to make sure you have some. So I think trying to put something in that gives you some coverage of capacity with whatever it is that and a mechanism for growth. And then also making sure that there's no take or pay, right? Like a lot of times manufacturers want to put that in there. And that's just something should avoid that at all costs, especially at the beginning. I think making sure you understand the loss factor they're using and that's in there. And, if they go over that, are they compensating you for that, if you're supplying ingredients, right? Like that's really important. What is the mechanism they can raise prices, right? So are they using some type of index, and what is that? And understanding that there's a cadence for that, and it's not just random 3 months from now we can raise your price, because I think that's something that happens a lot of the times is you go in and you go to manufacture something and then they're like, oh, after 3 times we find that this is too hard to run in the style, or it doesn't run as fast as we thought, and they want to change your price. So just really understanding those pieces so that you can plan for those, because you might not always be able to solve it, and sometimes you just need to get in and manufacture, but understanding the components and the levers is important.
When you say take or pay, is that essentially once the co-packer is done producing a run, they won't store it for very long? If you don't pick it up in time, then they're going to pay you. Is that what you mean by that?
No, I mean, if you want a capacity commitment, you have to pay for that regardless if you need it. You know what I mean? So like I want 1,000,000 cases a year. Well, okay, you're going to pay for 1,000,000 cases a year, whether or not, you need them, basically.
Certainly makes sense. For brands that start out self-manufacturing, whether it's starting in your kitchen, then maybe they shift to a shared commercial kitchen where they're sharing some space or whatnot. What's the most challenging part for those brands when they get to the point they're about to transition to a co-packer? I'm talking about things like formulation changes that you have to change, optimize for
Mhm.
much higher MOQs or whatnot. Like, yeah, what's the most challenging part of making that transition?
I think it's just, well, in general, the loss of control. So, right, when you're in your own facility, you can decide, like MOQ is a good one, right? I can run a small amount, or they don't care if they have to take time to do an allergen clean. So really lining up your production so that it best suits the manufacturer's line. They might not be able to cut in on an allergen
Sure.
every other week, it might be once a month. So really understanding those points, and also, the variability, right? So even going from different co-mans, regardless of whether it's in your plant first or a co-man, you still will have some variability, and understanding your tolerance for that, and ways you can kind of mitigate that
Yeah.
is really, I think that's something that's going to come up for sure.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And then on the other side, a kind of opposite scenario, brand's been working with a co-packer for a while, and then at some point they feel like they've gotten to a certain scale, they have the capital, they can get the financing or whatever, where it makes sense just to actually go the other way and vertically integrate and start looking at bringing manufacturing in house if they have the money to build out a facility and whatnot. Like, when does that you feel like it usually makes sense to start looking in that? And then when it does make sense, is there kind of like a step-by-step process you go through where maybe you start just sourcing your ingredients first, then you're sending them to the co-packer, and then maybe you start producing part of your SKUs in-house and you still keep the other co-packer? I know it's kind of a multi-part question, but I'll stop there.
I do think there's probably times where it makes sense. It depends on how complicated your manufacturing is. Pods, for example, we never wanted to do that because, first of all, to put in an aseptic plant, it's like probably 50 million. So the barrier to entry, the cost is too expensive. But if you're doing something like a dry powder, if you're doing something that is, a like a trail mix, something like that, it might be easier to get that up and running. But I do agree with you. You should anticipate that it's number one going to take longer to get it up and running and consistency. So you should not plan on just having a hard deadline of getting
Yeah.
out of your co-man, right? Like
Yeah.
just keeping them up and running until you're sure, as long as you can kind of afford that in your process. But I also think like people really need to make sure they run all the numbers before they want to bring in their own manufacturing, because it's just a different business to manufacture than sell. So, that line time, making it, are you really as utilizing as much as you thought you were going to utilize? And just having that food safety, you're responsible for all of that, right, on your own. So make sure that you have the right team in place and that the numbers really do make sense in the bigger scheme of things.
Right. I mean, it's a lot less complicated to just have a co-packer and there's one line item and say, I get the product and it costs me this much versus doing everything yourself, for sure. It's definitely a lot more complicated.
Yeah, and I wonder, like, maybe in the initial stages, maybe it's just better to find more ways to improve costs and collaborate with your co-man, and give them a part of the savings to be incentivized to help you automate more or figure out more things to make the costs go down.
Yeah, totally. Taking a step back from co-packers specifically, just talking about suppliers and partners in
Mhm.
general, especially with the tariff situation, everything going on in the world right now. Like, how important would you say is redundancy and supplier
Yeah.
diversity, let's say?
Think it's critical. And so it's not stuff. So ever since, basically the pandemic forward, there's been something almost every, year or 18 months where just another panic mode, and we're almost numb in the supply chain world at this point. But I think 100%, especially for key ingredients, every ingredient, if you can, you need to have redundancy, and co-mans, you need to have redundancy. And I think for key ingredients, it needs to be, I have two that I'm running in parallel. So there's different levels, right? Like you could have somebody approved, but you don't necessarily order from them, but they're a solution. But then for key ingredients that are critical to your product, have an 80-20% rule. Like one is at 80, one is at 20%. So you keep them going. Same with co-mans. And then I think it's also even having like a third supplier. Like It's if you have the time and ability to qualify different suppliers, like having a third one in the mix too. It's not only just for like supply chain issues, it's for if you're managing your own ingredients, having the ability to do an RFP when you scale. I mean, it might sound like it's not a big deal at the beginning, but like once you start getting into the, 50 million range, you've got some decent volume, and you can do RFPs and you can find cost savings that you didn't in the early days.
Yeah. When you on the co-packer side specifically talking about having redundancy, and if you, and I'm not sure, maybe you would just say I don't recommend this in general, but versus having just one prove that you can pivot to quickly versus maybe you're actually producing with two co-packers at the same time on an ongoing basis just for diversity and any
Yeah.
other reasons that might feel important. How do you, is it, I assume it's a challenge and maybe it's not, but if it is, like, how do you ensure if you're having the same co-packer producing the same SKUs to ensure there's product consistency across all the different co-packers?
hmm I mean, number one is you should be getting samples of your runs every time. You should be the last person that looks at that product before. This is not everybody does this, but I do think you should be the last person that looks at the product before it goes to a consumer because, not necessarily from a food safety standpoint, but although that's important, I think it's more of those soft things like the quality standpoint or the sensory that you know your product better than anybody else and you know the tolerance that you have. And if you're not maintaining that over time and watching it, it could drift. So I think that's the biggest way and through trials. Yeah. But you're basically having a positive release program in house where you can still have product go to your distribution center or your in-house or your third party, 3PL location, but you have them hold it until you've said, "Oh, we've reviewed this product and we're good to go."
Yeah. Talked about supplier diversity. What does that supplier diversity actually like look like? Is it just having a few backups, or is it more strategic, like maybe one ingredient supplier sourcing majority of their stuff from, I don't know, Southeast Asia, but maybe that area is prone to typhoon risk or something like that? Is it also like, is it beyond just having a backup? Is it more strategic, like different parts of the world, or like what other
Yes.
variables should take into account?
Definitely geographic diversity is important. So things like coconut, if you're sourcing that, just make sure that you're using a different region. It's not just, I mean, things can happen in a region, like typhoons, it could be weather, but it can also be just container shipments. Maybe there's a port that's an issue, as simple as that. And that could cause you, weeks of delay that you don't have. I mean, it's not always possible for everything, but it could also be helpful to have that geographic diversity because costs, right? Like, so, oats are maybe made in Canada, they're made in the US, but maybe Canada had really bad weather that season and it's not so bad in the US where it's grown. I'm just throwing that out there, but just different ways that cost impacts things as well. I do think it is having multiple, but also geographic diversity is important in your thought process when you're picking alternate suppliers.
Yeah, totally. Talking about COGS and margins for a second, where would you say most brands go wrong when it comes to forecasting COGS and margins?
I just think not thinking about everything and just understanding. I mean, I think freight is a big area where people don't always understand all the extra costs that are there and factor in for that. So fuel surcharges, lumber charge, they different customers make you unload it. Like you just have all these different fees that kind of come in after the fact and you didn't account for it. So it just balloons your costs. I think warehousing and carrying too much inventory, right? Like not having that balance right, that can stack up really fast, having stuff in storage or having stuff not understanding, how much you need to have on hand and then having some go to shelf life, depending on how short your shelf life is. And you've got to either donate that or kind of sell it to a grocery outlet type thing. These things all like start to add up on the back end. I think going back to the loss factor too, understanding, what the potential loss factor is if you're supplying your own materials. That's an area too. So it's all these like kind of hidden back
Yeah.
things that happen after the fact that are harder to account for.
Yeah, totally. What is the most common way that things can kind of get away from you from a margin and COGS standpoint?
And I think it's asking, trying to get benchmarks, right? So that's one of the things I think since the pandemic that people have kind of leaned more into like having discussions with other companies and their supply chain teams, like we would do that all the time, just understanding what's going on in the market, understanding what costs should be, what is your percent of sales for freight, what is your percent of sales for warehousing, what is your product margin targets, right? So seeing what is other people are doing, so you have industry benchmarks, and then also maybe putting in a plus or minus, like a, kind of a worst case scenario, have just having that and adding in, X percent to that in case you're missing anything and knowing that you're still okay if you're at that level. And I think having a continuous improvement mindset, like cost savings, you can't wait until down the road. You have to keep every year. I think the most important thing is going, okay, is what is the lowest hanging fruit for us right now? What could we look at? And not just trying to wait until it's a bad situation to try to create a path to profitability, right? It's doing it all along the way. It's these little things that you do along the way, just like, working out every day. It's like it adds up over time.
Yeah, it's not something you do once and set it and forget it. It's something you have to
Right.
keep being diligent around. Yeah, totally.
For sure.
In terms of new product development and introducing new products and new SKUs into the supply chain and the ecosystem, what would you say are you found are some of the keys to a successful new product launch in terms of one, like hitting your budget and
Mhm.
then also actually hitting your launch timeline goals? Because I know that's the most common thing is hitting the actual launch you had in mind initially for a new product launch is not the easiest thing to hit.
Definitely. And it takes longer than people think, right? I mean, it could take a year to launch a new product if you did everything right. And so I think the biggest thing is having a tool that tracks, what are the tasks that need to be accomplished and who's accountable for them. I mean, it doesn't have to be an expensive tool. Asana worked perfectly well for this. It's a great tool for this. And managing to that and what is, you know, the worst case scenario that can happen. And I think how you determine that worst case scenario, mapping everything out, is you get your team together, even sales, like right when you're developing a product, somebody who's in each department, and then you beat it up. Like, what could be a problem with this? What do we think could go wrong? Like really like having those worst case scenario discussions so that you plan for it. And you just can't take your foot off the gas. It is something where every week you have to be checking in. Where are we with this? What's happening? Because time is your enemy in a product launch, and it just goes faster than you think.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's definitely what I've found too. And then from an operations side of things specifically, how do you think about introducing new products, production line scheduling and all those things, and how to think about, I need to allocate, are you adding time to the production line or are you pulling some away?
Yeah, I honestly think this is probably like another thing to think about when you're going into looking at co-mans. What other capabilities do they have? Like, where do you see your brand growing? Like, if it's a bottling plant, what size packages can they do? Because it's always different. What lids can they do? So really like knowing that up front and starting to to think about it, and then engaging with your whole team, your sales team, when you do your innovation planning, like, oh, okay, what are all options at our current co-man so we could maximize our volume there? And then if you need to go somewhere else, that's fine. But you like at least try to maximize what you can and get the most economies of scale with your current co-man. I think if you do some of that thinking up front, also just understanding, are you putting allergens into something? Because a lot of times you can, with your MOQs, you can kind of usually run two or three flavors or products per shift. And how would that fit in there? Is there different allergens? How could you run them and lay them out in production to make it efficient? Have that conversation with your co-man, because they're usually more than willing to like engage in that kind of discussion and understand how things could be done more efficiently. But at the end of the day, like, you do want to try to optimize where you can, but you need to make products that sell, and there's that vision in the founder that has something that they want to make, and our job is to get it made, on the supply chain side, and figure it out the best that we can.
Yeah, yep. All that makes total sense. From a packaging standpoint, I know how do you recommend brands maybe balance that desire to obviously have the best packaging that's going to stand on the shelf the best versus that desire to optimize for efficiency in terms of labor, touch points,
Mhm.
automation. Obviously, that goes into partly what automation the co-packer has and whatnot. But how do you feel like? How do you think about balancing the two?
I mean, it's tough because you're right. You do, the package is very meaningful and how people pull that off the shelf. I think there's different things, right? There's different components to it. I don't think it's always one or the other. I think it's more thinking about, do you want a 6 or a 12 pack, right? Like those types of things, because thinking about slotting, like if I have a 6 pack, I'm only going to have to do, and they want a free case per store at the beginning. The six, you're thinking about it holistically, like that's going to cost me a lot of money, right?
Yeah,
I think, there's different things that you can do after the fact too to automate more, right? So let's
sure.
say, first of all, you're going to go in and you're going to find out what that co-man has and what kind of package they could do, what kind of bottle they could do, what kind of bag. But you can also, do things after the fact that make things easier or more automated with equipment. So you might start out and it might not be as efficient, but how do you make it more efficient and still be the package that you want on shelf?
Yeah, yeah. All those are super helpful. There's definitely ways that you can also design your packaging and all the different components around that to make retailers' lives easier. The easier making things with retailers, probably the better chance you're going to have of getting more product on
Mhm.
the shelf and whatnot. I'm talking about like making picking and packing as easy as possible for the team, or stackability, or making the case packs as compact as possible. The more inventory a retailer can have in the back of their store. So, like, what are, in terms of some of those types of things, what would you say are some of the key things that brands should consider on this front?
Well, I think so when you're talking about retailers and, making it easier for them, I think one of the things that people don't always think about is the UPC and how is that done and is that clear? Is the best buy date like for consumers even like is that in a spot where your manufacturer have you even thought about where that's going to go? Is the color that you have on your package going to show up where the inkjet is, or if it's laser printed? So really having those conversations up front as you're designing the packaging, so your designer knows to build around it, and not like last minute you send your packaging to your co-man and they're like, oh wait, where are we going to put the where are we going to put the inkjet? So having those kinds of conversations, I think probably one of the more important things as far as it goes with designing the packaging. And like tuck tabs even like so with things like waffles where you're repacking, is that factored in? Because you get a die line and it doesn't always show everything on there. And so if you don't kind of work through like let's go buy some materials in market and see what they look like so you can or your co-man may have a physical package or your packaging supplier would have like some examples of what they've already done in this format, just thinking through, oh, this one doesn't have a tuck tab. I need to make sure I ask for that and getting that set up to begin with versus launching it like that. And it's just a consumer issue.
Then the refrigerated aisle and then frozen aisle, what type of substrates and materials are using in the packaging too, and thinking about some of that stuff, like how does condensation get
Yeah,
to impact materials, that kind of stuff too.
definitely. And and it's not even just in the original design. It's like when you do things over time, like let's say I've had stuff in my past where I've had to sticker over something because something wasn't right, the UPC wasn't right or something, and you've got to get that product to market. You literally have to make sure that label can withstand being in the fridge. And nobody thinks about that, right? It's not something that you would even, it's not common knowledge or something you think about. So that's a good point.
Yeah, totally. Shifting gears a little bit, talking about talent and team a little bit. I'm curious, how does a COO skill set need to evolve as a brand goes from 0 to 1 to small and scaling fast to larger scale where nutpods is today, let's say?
Yeah. Just at the beginning, it's so much more tactical and it does depend on, at the end, it's more like people building and teams and trying to make sure you're getting the right people and seats on the bus. But a lot of it depends on more on the CEO and their skill set. Are they stronger in that area or are they more on the sales side? And how much involvement they have. But really, it's just at the beginning, you're super tactical. You might be making the production schedule, you might be scheduling the shipments at the beginning on a founding team of 5. But then as you grow, really seeing where your gaps are, like mapping out your org chart and seeing who you need to bring on to make sure the scaling properly, looking at network optimization. So it's so much more strategic. The bigger you get, it's less just trying to get stuff out the door. It's where can we save? How can we make it better? How can we grow faster?
Yep, totally. In terms of those earlier stages, the founder launched a brand, they're building a brand, they're starting to get a bit of traction. What would you say is like the first ops hire that a founder should make? And maybe there's a few different scenarios where it kind of depends, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly, it's really somebody who's a jack of all trades, really, like in this supply chain world. You don't want somebody that's super deep on, they know a lot about production schedule. I mean, honestly, like it's different because if somebody's at a big company, they're typically super deep on something, right? Like they may only do scheduling, they may only do logistics. But really at the beginning, you need somebody that's got a breadth of knowledge that, can kind of fill a lot of gaps and understand more of the whole process versus somebody that's super deep on something very specialized.
Yeah. Thinking about, let's just say the first, I don't know, the end of the first year at nutpods compared to the 10th year, what did your ops org look like?
Yeah, I mean, we went from basically, I was the person, we had one other person at the early stages that was managing ops. And then, when we exited, a team of 13 people. So it was still pretty tight. I mean, for as big of a business it was, but we did have a co-man. So, they're doing a lot of the operations kind of functions. But we had, basically someone who oversaw quality, someone who oversaw R&D, and someone who oversaw supply chain. And they all kind of led that part of the business and then had people that supported them in each part of that business.
That's super helpful. Shifting gears a little bit, obviously you've had a lot of wins under your belt, but yeah, I think some of the best learning experiences come from times when didn't necessarily go as expected or planned. I'm curious, like any initiatives that you worked on or strategies you implemented that you worked on didn't necessarily work or go as planned. And looking back, what did you kind of learn from that, or anything you feel like you would have done differently at all that jumps out?
I'm trying to think about that. I don't know if I have a certain scenario that's different. I just think usually things don't always go as planned, right?
For sure.
I think that things are bumpier than you think. I think when we've done moves like warehouse moves,
Yeah.
I think it was a little naive at the beginning to think, oh yeah, we're just going to do this warehouse move. We're going to save so much money and it's just going to be super easy. And I think really not being prepared that it's going to be bumpy and understanding that and making sure there's time, you've kind of planned with your team, we're going to have to put some extra time into this. Maybe we need an extra person to come in, and try to help us do this move or ramp it up because things like that are certainly bumpy. Changing commands are bumpy and harder than you think. So I think just acknowledging and really having a mindset that there's 10 things that are going to go wrong, right? Like it's never going to go as planned, but how you react to it and how you're prepared for anything can happen is really where it'll help it'll help ease the
Yeah, having
blow.
that mindset makes a lot of everything easier to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Last question for you. Any brands or just general trends in this broader CBG space that you're particularly excited about and or trends you wish you would have jumped on earlier looking back now?
Well,
Either one
one
of
of
those
the
you can
things,
answer or both.
yeah, no, I just one of the so I did mentoring for the first time with SKU. I was involved with SKU in Austin last year. And I think it's really cool because you get to see a lot of early stage brands and people are still coming up with new innovations. I think there's so much in the like the kelp, like the whole kind of foods that we're not used to eating that have a lot of nutritional value and making them palatable, like foraged and found was in that group. So kelp pickles and things like that. And Long Table was in our cohort that we had, and they did, Samuel did, he does a popcorn flour. So he makes popcorn and makes flour out of it for the pancake mixes that they sell. And it totally changes the dynamic, makes it light and airy, but I would have never thought of that. So what I think is really cool about this industry is there's still new things that people are coming up with that are helping, helping people get better foods in their system and they're innovative and they're still passionate about it. So that's what I like seeing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's cool to see there's still innovation happening this far into the space.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Tara, this has been awesome. Really appreciate the time. Where's the best place for people to follow along with you? And then also best place to follow along with Evergreen as well.
Yeah. So for me, LinkedIn is probably the best place. And then Evergreen, Instagram, Eat Evergreen on Instagram is probably the best place. Our website's eatevergreen.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll link to it in the notes too.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well,
Thank you
Tara,
so much. I
appreciate it. This has been
appreciate
great.
it.
Really appreciate the time. This has been fun.